Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Nikon Z-mount version of Tamron 70-180mm F2.8 VC G2 lens. Now, what's interesting is that this now completes the trinity of fast f2.8 zooms here on Nikon. All of these lenses have been available on Sony E-mount before, but they have been trickling over to Nikon Z-mount, and the 70-180mm is the last of them to arrive. I've been taking a look at all three of the lenses. I won't be giving them all an individual review. I will give them an overview, but since this is the latest to arrive, I will give you a review of this as kind of a representative of how these lenses have translated onto Z-mount. Now, of course, the first generation of Tamron zooms arrived at a time when Nikon Z-mount was closed to third-party development. However, it's pretty obvious that there was some kind of agreement between Tamron and Nikon that resulted in all three of those lenses, the 17-28, 28-75, and 70-180mm f2.8 zooms, being released as Nikon branded lenses. Now, of course, the platform is opened up and we have openly Tamron lenses being released. The question is are they worth buying? Well, one thing is obvious. The G2 lens has a lot of additional features. It has image stabilization, optical stabilization built into the lens, faster autofocus motor, and of course, it comes at a price point that still undercuts the Nikon branded 70-180mm lens and definitely undercuts the $2,900 S-line 70-200mm lens from Nikon. So at the end of the day, this obviously is going to serve as an excellent value, and today we're going to dive in to see if it also is an excellent lens. So before we dive into it, I will give you a quick caveat disclaimer. This lens was loaned to me by Tamron USA along with the 16-30mm and 28-75mm f2.8 G2 lenses. And however, they have had no input on this review process. My findings are my own, as always. All right, let's talk about the build and handling of the 70-180 G2. Quick breakdown on prices. $1,149 is the MSRP for the 70-180 G2. The Nikon 70-180, which is the Tamron G1, essentially, is $1,400 for the MSRP, though it's more likely to be on sale for less. But so far, I've never seen it as low a price as the $1,149 that this lens is selling for. And then, of course, if you're looking at the S-line lens, the 70-200 S-line, it is $2,900, ouch, US dollars. And so obviously a huge difference in price there. Now, in terms of the size here, this is another area where Tamron has had an advantage. It continues to have an advantage relative to the full 70-200 f2.8 zooms. This lens is 83mm in diameter, or 3.26 inches, 158.7 millimeters in length, so just a couple of millimeters longer in Z-mount version, and then that's 6.2 inches, and it weighs in at 865 grams, or 30.5 ounces. So to give you a little bit of perspective on size, the S-line 70-200 is 61 millimeters longer and weighs in at 495 grams heavier. And so if you are someone that's wanting to shoot weddings and you can't imagine carrying around the bulk of the S-line all day, this is a really, really nice alternative because it's very moderate in terms of the size and weight. And it manages to retain the 67mm front filter thread that is shared across all three of these lenses here, these zooms, plus pretty much all, with just a couple of exceptions, of Tamron's other releases on mirrorless space. And so really great job on that point, Tamron, keeping that commonality, and so you can share filters across all of these lenses, which is great. Now, part of the G2 upgrades include essentially a function button and a USB-C port, and then on the 70-180, we have a custom switch that gives you three different functions that you can employ using that button there. And so the way that you program this is you attach via the weather-sealed USB-C port to a computer or an app, and there you have the ability to go in and to customize the behavior of the lens through something called Tamron's Lens Utility software. And then the Lens Utility, you can assign from a number of values to each one of these three custom positions. And then when you activate the button, and you have even options on how you're going to do that. Is it going to be just a touch, or is it going to be holding it down? So you have some options on how that is going to play out. Now, of course, here on Tamron, the manual focus ring is functions as a customizable control ring. So one of the functions I like to set up is I actually like to, in camera, set up the customizable control ring for aperture control, or in video for power aperture, and then to set up AF/MF to one of these custom buttons. And so I can have aperture control here and then just click a button and go into manual focus if I want to manually focus. And so it gives me kind of an aperture ring, even though there isn't technically an aperture ring, it gives me the option of doing that. You've got other things. You can do focus limiter, you can set AB focus, you can set a focus towards infinity for astro. There's a variety of different things that you can program into that. And then on top of that, you also can program the way that the actual focus ring, the ring is going to behave, whether it is linear or non-linear, how far the throw is, even what direction you want it to move in. So you can really tweak the lens to your preferences. Now, at the end of the day, I prefer a more traditional control scheme. I would just like to have an AF/MF switch. I'd like to have a focus limiter switch. I'd like to have an aperture ring. However, this is a serious upgrade from either Tamron G1 70-180, but then also the more expensive Nikon 70-180, which had none of that functionality. So all of that is good. And because I can set this as a power aperture ring, I can do aperture racks. They're not the absolute smoothest I've seen. It's not, I would say, Nikon lens quality, but it's close, and so I appreciate that, to be able to do that. We've got 9 aperture blades, and as you can see in the aperture rack, we'll look at it again, it does a good job of maintaining a circular shape as you stop it down. Build quality here is definitely nicer than the first generation lens. There's more sculpting to the design. Just the textures and everything feels a little bit better. It's still engineered plastics in the body, but it does feel more upscale than what we have seen before. We do have a very thorough weather sealing here. There are 11 different seal points, as you can see in this diagram, plus a flooring coating up front. All of that very appreciated. And then we have a very minimum focus distance. So you're going to get your highest magnification on the 70mm end. You can focus as closely as 30 centimeters and get a 0.38 times level of magnification, which is really quite high, obviously. Though you can see that it's not a very flat plane of focus if I'm shooting something like a test chart at that distance. I can get better results here. You can see me holding the leave at the minimum focus distance, and it's filling the frame pretty well, more useful there. At the telephoto end, I can focus as closely just as 85 centimeters with a 0.21 times level of magnification, but a little bit flatter plane of focus. The lens does not include a tripod collar, and while you probably can get something third-party, it's really not designed around that, and frankly, I haven't had any issues with that. I felt like the lens balanced nicely when I was doing my test charts, and so I didn't really have any issues with that. Another key improvement over the first generation lens is the inclusion of Tamron's VC, or vibration compensation. And so that is going to work in conjunction with if you have VR in your camera body. And so I found nice, good stability for my work. I didn't really notice any shots affected by, motion blur from camera shake, though obviously no amount of VR is going to stop action. And so if your subject is moving, you're still going to get some motion blur based on that. There's only one real negative that I can point to relative to the Nikon branded 70-180, and that is that lens did support Nikon's teleconverters, whereas here we have no teleconverter support. And so that is one area of loss, and that could be probably the prevailing factor of why you might consider sticking with the original Nikon 70-180mm. In general, however, this is a really nice lens. It's smaller, it's lighter, and it's a whole lot cheaper, and it now has some decent functionality to it, though not in a necessarily conventional control type scheme. So let's talk autofocus. All three of these G2 zooms come with Tamron's VXD focus motor. That stands for Voice Coil Extreme Torque Linear Drive. And so it is their voice coil style linear motor, which is obviously faster than the RXD stepping type motor that was in the first generation of lenses. That means that we do have more thrust available here, and it's also a smoother, quieter focus motor. I'm still not entirely sure what the relationship between Tamron and Nikon is at this point. Obviously, we're getting full-frame Tamron zooms and not primes, but zooms, but we're not getting any of Sigma's full-frame lenses. And so there's obviously some kind of arrangement that has allowed Tamron in. And it does feel like these lenses get really, really good support. It feels very much like using a native lens, and so I was able to track birds in flight without any kind of real issue, other than one set where for some reason autofocus didn't pick up and never picked up throughout the burst for whatever reason. But in general, autofocus was really quite good in that kind of setting, tracking with good accuracy. What's more, you can see here, there is really, really good thrust in terms of, and speed going from close to distant subjects. It's pretty close to instantaneous. And so I had no issues with anything like that. I found it fine to use for event type settings, at church and things like that. And so in general, I found that autofocus is going to be fast enough to keep up with whatever really you want to do. Autofocus is also extremely quiet. It's smooth. There's none of that sometimes double clutch action or pulsing that I'll sometimes see on Nikon, but it just feels like it's confident and again, feels like it is a Nikkor lens in terms of the performance. And so all of that is good. And so in general, I have no reservations when it comes to autofocus for stills, other than I do find that kind of just in general, I will get a periodic miss, not necessarily a major miss, but just a little forward or back focus, just not quite as much precision as what I saw on Sony. That's probably an algorithm thing at this point. And I'm hoping that a firmware update in the future will help us to get all the way up to really top tier performance, as I saw with the same lens on Sony E-mount. All right, how about autofocus for video? Obviously, this is an absolutely cruddy day outside. It's been raining, it's cool. We're heading into the gray time of year, which I don't enjoy. However, autofocus for video in general has been fairly good on this lens, with just at least one caveat that I will mention. When it comes to doing things like focus pulls, touch to focus on Nikon, you don't have any control over it, how it works, and so it's not as smooth as what it should be. None of your settings that you input for controlling how autofocus works in video, none of those apply to touch to focus, and so I find that this has to be a little bit of a mess on this platform. However, you can see that there's definitely some pulsing, a bit of focus breathing, but it's very, very minor. It's actually quite well controlled. And in fact, when I went to my hand test, that went much better because now my settings are showing up, and you can see that the transition from my hand to my eye is good, and also focus breathing is so minimal, you don't see any of that jarring effect of going back and forth. It just transitions from one subject to the other. The one caveat that I did mention is that I found autofocus was a little bit slow to pick me up at times, and so I've had to be very careful while filming outdoors. I'm filming all of these outdoor segments with the lens on my Nikon Z8. I've had to be very careful to make sure that it gets focused on me, and of course the fact that I can't monitor it from the front on the Z8 because it's just a tilt screen makes that a little bit harder. It doesn't always immediately pick me up, and so it's not always reactive. As I approach the camera and I ducked out of frame, you can see that basically it just kind of cheated. It never went to the background, and so when I came back in frame, I was basically in focus, but because focus hadn't shifted at all. And I have found that I have to be careful to give it time to pick me up and to not do anything that's too reactive or requires too much reaction, because it's just a little bit slow to react in that setting. At the same time, I shot this shot of a seagull swimming around, and focus was nice and stable all throughout the clip. So really no major concerns there. Just that one caveat that, again, I feel like a firmware update could probably help to tweak that to where it just reacts a little bit more appropriately to more sudden movements or something entering or exiting the frame. All things considered, however, I didn't really have any issues with autofocus, and as you've been able to see in these outdoor segments, focus is really nice and stable on myself without any kind of hunting or pulsing or jumping around. All right, well, let's talk about the optics here. We have 20 elements in 15 groups, and that includes molded glass aspherical, hybrid aspherical, low dispersion, and extra low dispersion elements as a part of that design. You can see that the MTF chart on both the wide and telephoto ends looks really, really impressive. Extremely sharp in the center. I mean, basically almost at 100% in the center, and then very strong in the mid frame, and really not all that big of a drop there into the corner. What I found in testing for various things here on Nikon using a 45 megapixel Z8 is that I found no longitudinal style chromatic aberrations either on my test chart or when shooting my dad's old SLR. Everything is really, really clean there. So that's great. No lateral style chromatic aberrations in the corners. All of that is good. We do see some pincushion distortion throughout the zoom range. And so on the 70mm end, I needed a -4 to corrected in a nice linear fashion. No big deal there. And as typical on Z mount versus Sony E mount, I found that it did have a little bit more vignette. In this case, I needed a +74 to correct, whereas I was more around a +50 on E mount. On the telephoto end, there's a little bit more pincushion distortion. I needed a -7 to correct for it. Again, nice and linear, no big deal. And vignette is also a little bit heavier. It is now up to a +85. In this case, however, I saw a fairly similar result on Sony E mount. I needed a +75 to correct for the vignette there, and so not a radical difference between the two. All of these things are pretty easily correctable, and fortunately these Tamron G2 lenses do get full profile support in camera here on Nikon for video and then also for JPEGs as well. So all of that is great. Starting on the wide end at 70mm, looking at 200% levels of magnification, I found that crops, even at f2.8, looked really good all across the frame. They looked good in the center, they looked strong in the mid-frame, and the corners were really not all that degraded. The biggest difference I found when stopping down the lens is less in the center. There was some contrast improvement in the center, but you can see here in this comparison on the edge of the frame for a real-world shot that there's just more contrast, more detail there in the textures. It looks really, really good. However, I mean, even in the corners, if I'm looking back at the test chart at f5.6 and f8, it looks fantastically sharp even in the corners. So really, really impressive there. By f11, you're going to start to see a little bit of effects of diffraction, and at the minimum aperture of f22, that becomes more pronounced, so not as bad as what you'll see on Sony because of the higher resolution point at 61 megapixels on my A7R5. So I saw a little bit less diffraction on this lower resolution point here on Nikon. As we go throughout the zoom range, I found that actually 100mm is stronger still than 70mm, basically all across the frame, just a little bit more pop contrast. It looks fantastic. Really, really strong results at 100mm. At 135mm, there's a little bit of a dip, though it's still good. It's just not as exceptionally good as we have seen to this point. But we see at 180mm, we see a rebound to where it is again fantastically sharp, really all across the frame. And so really strong and consistent optical performance throughout as far as resolution and contrast. You're not going to be disappointed in what this lens is able to produce. The bokeh quality is good, but it's zoom good, not high-end prime good. And so I found that in most situations it looks good. Obviously you have the ability to really defocus a background if you're close to your subject and shooting at 180mm in f2.8. It's more in the transition areas where you're not so close to your subject, where the bokeh can get a little bit of a nervous quality to it. But in general, I felt like the bokeh looks good from the lens, and I would say that images generally, as you can see here, look really nice. I also found that the colors are nice from the lens. I felt like flare resistance overall is good. It's got Tamron's B-Bar Generation 2 coatings, and those tend to do a really good job with that. So in general, we have a very strong optical performance here, particularly when you consider the price point of this zoom lens relative to the competitors. So my conclusion is that all three of these lenses in my test have really converted over to Nikon Z mount really, really well. There are definitely there's some give and take on the way that all of these lenses perform on Nikon relative to Sony. I find that autofocus is still a little bit more sophisticated on Sony, which I feel like it is in general. But I also find that the in-body stabilization on a camera like my Z8 is still better than anything that I'm seeing on my Sony cameras. And also, of course, here on Nikon, you have none of the third-party restrictions. Things like burst rate. I can shoot up to the full burst rate of my Nikon Z8 without any kind of limitation there. However, what we have lost relative to the Nikon 70-180 was the ability to use Nikon's own teleconverters. And so that obviously is a loss that I miss and that some of you are going to miss. And so that would be, in my mind, the only compelling reason to stick with the Nikon branded lens as opposed to this new G2 version, which is basically better in every other category that I can think of. The final major consideration here, of course, is cost. And even though this G2 version is updated and improved in a number of ways, it does undercut the Nikon branded 70-180 F2.8. And of course, if you're comparing to the premium 70-200mm S-line lens, you're talking about a difference between $2,900 and essentially under $1,200, and so it's just a huge difference. In fact, when I did the math and I added up the cost of the 16-30, 28-75, and 70-200mm Tamron zooms, G2 zooms, I found that their total was only $30 more expensive than the S-line 70-200mm. And so if you're looking at filling out your bag with zooms, this certainly is a really great value way to accomplish that. And so I'm certainly very happy to have Tamron's own lenses here on the market, and particularly this trinity of fast f2.8 zooms. They really provide really solid alternatives for those of you on a tighter budget that can't afford to go all the way up to the premium Nikon equivalents. So at the end of the day, that is a very welcome addition here. Now, if you want more information, I do have a full text review on this particular lens that is linked in the description down below on the newly redesigned DustinAbbott.net. Go check that out. Also, if you want a deep dive into the optical performance, hey, you're in the right place. Stay tuned. We're going to jump into that together right now. So we'll start by taking a look at the zoom range here. So obviously 70-180mm isn't quite as good as 70-200mm, but you can see as I zoom in and out, gives you a lot of different framing options there. As far as optical characteristics, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see at 70mm, we have some pincushion distortion. You can see it corrects in a nice linear fashion, even if I'm manually correcting. Definitely some pretty heavy vignette in the corners, and that clears up with a +74 dialing in at 70mm. That pincushion distortion persists and grows as you go throughout the zoom range by 180mm. We're up to needing a -7 to correct. You can see it remains nice and linear, no problems there. Also, vignette is a little bit heavier and comes a little bit further into the frame, I will note as well. And I needed a +85 to correct for it here. Again, there is correction profile support, so if you're not manually correcting, like I'm turning profiles off, and so I can show you what's going on optically, but this will correct in camera for you. Longitudinal style chromatic aberrations are really not a problem. You can see it's nice and neutral before and after the plane of focus. Likewise, if I go into a more hardcore real-world situation with lots of shiny bits here, you can see it's very good contrast in the imprints here, and then no fringing showing up here. Likewise, around the specular highlights, no fringing. However, as we're looking at those specular highlights, you'll notice that there is some inner lining and a little bit of busyness inside. They're not entirely smooth. There's a little bit of clipping towards the edge, stopping down here to f4. You can see they're largely circular by f5.6. You can see all circular, and the 9 rounded aperture blades are doing a pretty good job of keeping a circular aperture shape. Lateral style chromatic aberrations also very well controlled. No evidence of any kind of fringing here at the edge of the frame. So we'll take a look at resolution and contrast. This again is on a 45 megapixel Nikon Z8, and we're looking at 200% magnification. Center of the frame looks awesome. Great detail, great contrast. Mid-frame is looking really strong. If I pan down here, we can see a little bit of a fade there to the lower right corner. You can just see it's a little bit the texture is just a little bit more smeared compared to the upper left corner there, and down into the corner itself. Really, we're holding off really quite well right into the corners. No major issues there. What I found in this real-world shot, that if we have f2.8 and then f5.6, you can see looking in the center of the frame, it is a little sharper and more contrasty, but not radically different. Just more contrast levels have deepened. If we pan off to the side here, however, we can see that textures are just a slight bit muddier here at f2.8, but at f5.6, they're staying really consistent right off to the very edge there. At f5.6 and f8, we can see if we look right up here into the corner, it looks fantastically sharp right up into the very corner, right up near the edge. No problems there. Very sharp at smaller apertures. Now, if we stop on down to f11, you see f11 still looking good. By f22, however, it is softened somewhat due to diffraction. You can just see that the contrast is gone. You see all these wavy lines of texture in here. Those are almost not visible because of so much contrast that has been lost there at smaller apertures. If we move on in the zoom range to 100 millimeters, you can see it looks amazing in the center of the frame, and if you stop it down to f4, it looks better still. Mid-frame looks awesome, particularly by f4 there, and up into the corners. The corner looks really strong, and by f4, it looks fantastically strong. At 135 millimeters, there's a little bit of a dip. You can see it's just not quite as popping off the page, even at f4. Still good, but not what I would call exceptionally good. Mid-frame in some ways looks almost better than the center, and the corners, it's a pretty consistent performance. The corners still feel very, very sharp relative to the center. So overall, still a good performance even at its weakest. Then at 180 millimeters, you can see it rebounds to just incredible sharpness and contrast in the center of the frame. You can see it's just popping. f4 looks great. Mid-frame looking really, really strong, particularly by f4. And right up into the corners, looking awesome. So a really strong performance at the end of the telephoto range, which is arguably maybe the most important point. So here's a couple of real-world examples here at 200 millimeters. You can see, even at f2.8, lots of detail all around the plane of focus and very accurate focus there. All of that is great. Here is minimum focus distance at 180 millimeters. You can see the plane of focus is still not perfectly flat, but good contrast and detail there in the middle of the frame. You can get a higher level of magnification at 70 millimeters. It's that same, not really flat plane of focus. However, detail and contrast looks quite good here. And so a very usable amount of magnification and performance up close. This gives you a look at some flare resistance here. So you can see at 70 millimeters, we've got a little bit of a ghosting coming in, but overall contrast stays good. With the tighter framing here, that sun is right out of frame, and you can see just a little bit of a veiling effect up here, but overall we've got nothing penetrating down into the frame to mess things up. So not bad at all. Also a look here at the nice amount of defocus you can get. At its best, when you're completely defocusing the background, it's gorgeous. Detail looks really good. Background's blurred out nicely. This image on a frosty late autumn morning looks amazing. And again, the frost kind of helps to soften edges a bit, and so it all just blends together really beautifully. Likewise here at very up close, good detail and contrast as you can see, and then a nicely blurred background. Now, here at 70 millimeters, I'm relatively close, but you can see there's definitely some of that outlining we saw on specular highlights. Not completely smooth, but you can also zoom in here and then smooth everything out just via compression. And so it really is relative to where you're set up. Overall, however, you can see though, it's a really, really nice optical performance. All right, so thanks for watching until the very end, and I hope that the deep dive into the optics has helped you to determine whether or not the 70 to 180 millimeter G2 is going to be your new zoom lens. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.